Finance Minister Mathias Cormann. Mathias Cormann, thank you for your time and your patience while we ran through everything that's happening in Washington at the moment. What do you make of Labor's request of the PM that he should be pushing for more progress on the US-China trade impasse?
Well, I mean, we obviously always call on both the US and China to resolve their issues as swiftly as possible, because that is in Australia's interest, and we believe it's in the interest of the United States and China, and indeed it's in the interest of trading nations around the world. I mean, that is something that we do as a matter of course.
And what are you hoping that the Prime Minister can achieve in this visit? As Laura Days was just saying, it is a remarkable show of support for Australia, that it's such an extended visit, that he has been granted a state dinner, just the second one in Trump's presidency.
Well, it's a great demonstration of the amazing friendship, partnership, strategic alliance between Australia and the United States, which has underpinned our national security and our economic prosperity for a very long time. I mean, it's an incredibly important relationship, and as the Prime Minister just said there, it's while it is a strong and deep and broad relationship, you do need to tend to this relationship so that 100 years of mateship can follow on the last 100 years of mateship.
What's really quite remarkable about this trip too is there's a lot of business leaders joining the Prime Minister. There's going to be a trip to the Visy plant with Anthony Pratt and the Prime Minister and President Trump going to Ohio. At the state dinner, we've got Kerry Stokes, Anthony Pratt as well, Gina Reinhart, Andy Penn. Is that a deliberate move by the Australian government to be bolstering Australian businesses in the United States?
Well, I mean, our relationship with the US is our biggest economic relationship, in that the United States, I mean, the US is our biggest source of foreign investment, two-way investment, and, combined with the level of two-way trade, obviously makes for a very significant trade and investment relationship. Our trade relationship with China is the biggest, but in terms of the overall economic relationship, that is still with the United States. And so this is all just making sure that we continue to build on the foundation that is there, so that we can have the best possible opportunities into the future to take that even further.
Now, when it comes to news back in Canberra, we had the final budget outcome released yesterday, which did show that we are very close, or the budget is in balance. So that's been spruiked as positive news. But Labor says this is due to an underspend in the NDIS. Bill Shorten says it's because the NDIS is constipated. What do you make of that accusation?
Well, he's wrong. I mean, in 2018-19, we more than doubled the level of spending on the NDIS. We took spending from $4 billion a year before to $8.5 billion in 18-19. We increased the number of participants by 115,000 over the last 3 years. We took the level of participants in the NDIS from 30,000 to 300,000. I mean, the objective is to take it to 500,000 as swiftly as we can. I mean, this is a massive reform undertaking. For a very long time, Australians with a disability had inadequate support. The funding was organised at a state-based level through so-called block funding arrangements, where organisations would get a certain level of funding and had to do the best they could with it, whereas now there is an entitlement for every eligible Australian with a disability to get the services they need on a demand-driven formula. But it's a massive rollout, and there's a whole range of things that need to come together. Yes, one is the funding, and the funding is there. Two, I mean, obviously the states have got to cooperate, and some of the states were sadly slower than we would have liked in coming on board. But also, I mean, the providers have to catch up with their capacity to provide the services that are needed and that we then, are able to pay for. So, I mean, the fact that we've been able to increase the level of participants from 30,000 to 300,000 in 3 years has been a massive achievement. But, there is further to go, and we'll go as fast as we can, but bearing in mind that we are dealing with some constraints in terms of how fast the service provider market can keep up with meeting that demand as well.
Do you have any contingency plan if the iron ore prices fall?
Well, obviously we have made, very cautious assumptions. We've put in place very cautious forecasting assumptions when it comes to the iron ore price. Our expectation is that the iron ore price will reduced down to $55 a tonne. We've in the past, in 2018-19, we've assumed that the iron ore price would be $55 a tonne, but in fact it was $72 a tonne. Compare and contrast that with LIBOR. LIBOR assumed that the iron ore price would be high. In fact, we inherited a $120 a tonne iron ore price assumption. They assumed that, therefore, that revenue would be much higher than it ultimately was. And they spent all the money they thought they would rise and more. And when we first came into government, we had to chase revenue down because LIBOR used unrealistic pie-in-the-sky assumptions. Now, the way we are protecting ourselves from the volatility, the potential volatility in iron ore prices is by making more realistic, more conservative assumptions on where the price will be, so that we are not at risk of spending money that ultimately we won't have. And that is why over the last 3 years, for 3 budgets in a row now, we've been able to outperform our budget forecast. The final budget outcome for the last 3 years has been better, materially better than the budget forecast at the time of delivering the budget. In fact, $37.1 billion better. The bottom line has been $37.1 billion better than anticipated at budget time over the last 3 years, compared to the budget bottom line being $70 billion worse than anticipated at budget time during the last 3 years of the Labor government.
Now, the situation with the Biloela family, the Tamil family, continues. They say that they aren't being kept in the same standards of living that the Home Affairs Ministers presented in photographs, that they have been staying on Christmas Island. Why shouldn't they be brought back to Biloela to await the final outcome of the federal court hearing?
Well, I mean, they arrived in Australia without a visa, illegally by boat in 2012. They've gone through very comprehensive assessments by government. They've gone through very comprehensive assessments through the court, all the way to the High Court. And at every level, the assessments, and after the scrutiny, it's been confirmed that they are not validly here in Australia. They're not refugees. Obviously they've pursued a last-minute attempt to pursue further proceedings through the courts. That's taking its course, but pending that outcome, it is entirely appropriate, given all of the findings that have been made so far, that they arrived in Australia illegally without a visa by boat, that they are not entitled to the protection as refugees here in Australia under our laws and relevant international conventions. It's quite appropriate that they are treated the same way as everybody else. I mean, we've 1,500 Sri Lankans in the same circumstance have already returned to Sri Lanka. It would be entirely unreasonable and unfair to all of those Sri Lankans to treat these arrivals differently to the people that went before them.
There's been quite a bit of outrage about Pauline Hanson being appointed to lead or co-lead this family law inquiry from domestic violence victims. They say that her comments about women faking violence claims against their partners just to damage them are appalling. Do you think it's appropriate that she continues to co-chair this inquiry?
Well, I disagree with her comments, but she's not co-chairing the inquiry. She's the deputy chair of the inquiry. I mean, there's been quite a lot of misreporting.
Isn't that just semantics, really?
No, it's not semantics. The chair of the committee is Kevin Andrews on behalf of the government. Like every parliamentary committee has a chair and a deputy chair. Most parliamentary committees have got a Labor deputy chair. Some have Greens deputy chairs, or indeed one of them has got Rex Patrick from Centre Alliance as a deputy chair. Now, the truth is, in relation to all sorts of issues, from the economy to the environment to agriculture, infrastructure, I would fundamentally disagree with what Labor stands for, what the Greens stand for. But yet they still have the opportunity to serve as deputy chairs on these committees, because in the end these parliamentary committees are a reflection of the result of the last election and the diversity of views across the community. And the way these parliamentary committees operate and ultimately reach findings and recommendations is to ensure that all of the different views, as much as we might disagree with them, can be properly tested and scrutinised. And I hope that every member of the committee will be educated by listening to the Australian people in relation to what is a very complex, sensitive and difficult issue, and one where we would like to think that we can do better than what is currently the case. And the way democracy works is to allow people to express their views even as much as we disagree with them, so that ultimately we can get closer to the truth and closer to a better position. And if somebody has got bad views, I'm very confident that a committee process like this will expose those views for what they are.
But as a deputy chair, she'll have direction about what's being heard and in what capacity. Why not just put her on the inquiry as opposed to deputy chair when those are really quite evocative statements?
Well, that is quite inaccurate. The committee determines, the conduct of the committee inquiry. I mean, Senator Hanson is one of 10 members of that committee. The government has got 5 members on that committee. Senator Hanson is one member on a 10-member committee. And so, this is a normal run-of-the-mill parliamentary inquiry. This is not a court proceeding, incidentally. This is a parliamentary committee inquiry, part of our democratic process. And the way our democracy works is that, ultimately these committees, and as the parliament is a representation of the diversity of views across the community, consistent with the result at the last election. And ultimately, if we want to get the best possible findings and the best possible recommendations on the way forward, then it's important that the various views across the community are properly tested, and ultimately that judgments are made about the best way forward.
So if the role of deputy chair is that insignificant in the capacity of the committee, why have a deputy chair? Why have her as deputy chair?
Well, I mean, that is just the normal part of parliamentary procedure. I mean, every committee has a chair and a deputy chair. Most committees which have a government chair have an opposition deputy chair. A number of committees have crossbench deputy chairs from the Greens or from Centre Alliance, or indeed this committee from One Nation. I mean, that is a function of the results at the last election. And, obviously Senator Hanson has, expressed views in relation to this topic for a very long time. She's been an advocate in relation to this topic for a very long time. I don't agree with all of her views. Indeed, I suspect most Australians wouldn't agree with most of her views. But there is, obviously a section of the community who has got a particular perspective, which this committee will be able to test and ultimately form judgments about.
So just to be clear, you don't agree with her assessment that women fake domestic violence claims to punish their partners?
I've already made that very clear. No, I don't agree.
Okay. Finance Minister Mathias Cormann, thank you for your time.
Always good to talk to you.